Now, it's not too often that somebody who had a career spanning just 4 years will have a book written about him and that he'll still be talked about 50 years later. But such was the extraordinary talent of the man we're talking about now. He was voted Reading's best ever player on three different occasions and once famously kicked Mark Lawrenson in the face. We're talking about the man who did not give a damn. And I may have changed a word in there for radio reasons. We're talking about Robin Friday. To do so, I'm joined on the line by Stuart Kane, a novelist, researcher, and author of two books about Robin Friday. Man Friday first and second half. Stuart, thanks very much for joining me today.
No, it's lovely to be here, Enda. Thank you.
So firstly, before we actually get started and get stuck into Robin Friday's career and life as well, I'm always interested into why people write books about these players and about especially someone like Robin Friday, whose career was so short. What drew you to the story of Robin Friday?
I think, I mean, it was a number of things. I think a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, handed me the first book, the original book from '97, and said, "Have a read of this." And I played a bit of football myself when I was younger, and I read this book and I thought I loved it. I was really interested in it, but I had questions about it. And then I was doing a course, and I had to write a short story, and I was panicking, and I was thinking, what do I do? And then the tutor at the time held up this book, and it was A Damned United by David Peace, and I was like, oh, okay. And a good friend of mine, Matt, who'd the one that had recommended me the first book, I got a phone call from a friend saying that Matt had died, 39 years old, in very similar circumstances to Robin Friday. And at the time, and I thought, okay. So I bought the first book again, and I read it through, had The Damned United, and I thought, do you know what? What about exploring, Robin Friday's life? And it just grew. It just grew from there. And I think the intrigue is, why did it go the way it went? And I wanted to know if he really was as good as they say. And I think also it's those things with this guy that were ahead of his time, with what he was doing sort of on the pitch and off the pitch. And I've played with that in the story. I mean, I try not to move too close from the facts. I've probably broken a lot of rules in that I play with the games that he played, and have that. And very early on, I mean, you'd think that somebody like sort of Robin wouldn't have these sort of not a ceremony before the game, but a kind of doing things in a certain set way. You'd think, no, well, this guy wouldn't be like that. And very early on, when I started to write the short story, before I'd done any really deep research, he had this little list of things that he sort of did before a game. And I found out later that he did do this thing. He used to go around before every single game. He would go around, he would touch the whole team. It was this good luck thing that he had. And he would go around, come on, lads. And he'd go and touch each and every one of them, and making sure that things would go just right. And then he'd amble out onto the pitch and play the way that he played. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very much a game of his life, if you like. I've done it in two halves simply because, I mean, who wants a big tome that Man Friday that's 170,000 words long? So it's the first half is his rocky road to the top, with Charlie Hurley and Eamon Dunphy in there, and he has a bit of a double act going with Charlie Hurley, and Charlie Hurley having to control him, and keep tabs on him, and treat him with kid gloves. And then the second half is, about when things started to change and why they changed, really. I don't think that's any secret.
Yeah, I think when I prepare for these interviews, and when we're talking about someone from the 70s, 80s, 90s, generally the first thing I do is go onto YouTube and watch loads of highlights and go down a rabbit hole of their career. And you don't have that footage of Robin Friday. And that's something that adds to the myth of him, but also I read a piece that was on, I think it was these Football Times, that called him the greatest footballer you've never seen.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the feeling you definitely get from him. But there's so much more to him as well. And I think he was described as, if George Best, in his biography, if George Best was the first pop star of football, he was the first rock star of football. So there's a lot to this man's story. So let's start from the very beginning. What was his upbringing like? He grew up in 1950s England, so working class, I presume, and
Yeah.
probably
Yeah.
a tough enough upbringing.
A tough estate, and his friends, quite a few of whom were a bit older than him. He hung around with them. It was a rough estate, but I mean, in comparison, he was probably nothing compared to them. But he ended up obviously in Feltham Borstal, and at Feltham he was in the wing for those that had substance abuse problems, and then from there, Reading had a look at him when he was at Feltham. Right back then, he played a few games for them, but the manager there at the time was it was Jack Mansell, I think, prior to Charlie Hurley, didn't fancy him, probably because of what was going on. And I go into his home life a little bit, and I grow him up in the book quite quickly, because I think when you're from that background, you do have to grow up quickly to survive. He was he got viewed by a lot of people, because football can be a judgmental place. He got viewed as a lout a lot of the time by some people, and he wasn't necessarily that way. Sure, he had his moments, but he had to grow up quickly, in order to survive. But there he was, Feltham, and then he was married with a child at 17. His father didn't go to the wedding, to his first wedding. He married a black girl, Maxine. So that there are, I have that's there in his background, and it's going to have an impact. What I've tried to essentially do is kind of go right in there and take the reader into his mind, if you like. I'm not saying I'm Robin Friday, I'm not, but I think it's, if I could put it to the reader, that we're happy to go and watch a biopic at the cinema and have Robert De Niro play Marciano or whatever in Raging Bull, and essentially that's method acting. Well, kind of what I've done here is it's method writing. I've gone right in there, and I've looked at everything, and I've been sympathetic, and I've tried to be, as much as possible, I've tried to be objective, because with somebody like Robin Friday, it kind of can be quite easy to be, I don't want it. It's not fan fiction. It's definitely not that. I'm trying to be objective. But he's such a mesmeric character, and there's the music going on with him. He's interested in the rock music, and going out and doing this. And some people said, did he ever really want to be a footballer? Well, he definitely did, and he fought hard for it. There was obviously the accident when he was 21, when he was up on the rooftop and he slipped, and he impaled himself on a stake. Now, many say that it was that singular moment that changed Robin forever, and that he would live, each day as if it was his last. But he was already getting into a fair bit of trouble sort of prior to that. So he'd got into a sort of way of living, I think, and it was hard to shake that off.
Yeah, like when I was reading about him, it was very much, I almost had this image in my head where it was 1960s. I could almost hear the music going on in the background, and the sort of counterculture attitude. He almost, if he was a movie, it would be about the countercultural hippie movement, with the Rolling Stones in the background, and loads of like free love, all that kind of stuff going on. And that's sort of the image I get off him, even though like there's not that much footage of him at all. In terms of his narcotics use, because that's something that does come up later on in his career, do you get the feeling that in his teens that this was almost a coping mechanism, or do you think that it was just off his time and LSD was the thing then, and that's what he did?
I mean, it was LSD, and it was harder than that too. You know, he didn't mess about. Was it a coping mechanism? I think with that sort of thing, when you first start playing around with that, it's a bit of fun, and you go out. Robin Friday had a lot of fun. He did have a lot of fun. But then after that, it becomes something different, and it obviously became very different for Robin, and goes the way that it tends to go, and it, you know, with the sad ending. And I think that was something that was always there in the background. Sure, he liked to, you know, he liked to drink, but he, you know, there was the drugs there as well, and he kind of, you know, he kind of had the gateway, and then he climbed up through the ranks of narcotics. Now, without giving too much away, I do go into that in the book. And when you talk about the counterculture, I kind of play with that in the book. I've got him with his Led Zeppelin records and things like that. And he absolutely loved, his favorite was Janis Joplin. And I kind of play with the Janis Joplin thing, because she went, her death was very similar to his, you know, the way that it went, sadly. And I play with that. I kind of have him having conversations with Janis Joplin in these kind of this drug induced this state. And so she's kind of in it, and he's having these chats with her. And it's ultimately, it was his way of escaping, and not wanting to deal with the things that he was having to deal with. There was not a lot going on. There was stuff going on with his brother outside of the football that would have been hard to cope with. Married 3 times before he was 30. I mean, that's some going.
Let's talk about his football then, because I think we have enough context there in terms of who he was and what he did. Because there, like I said, there is very little footage of this guy, maybe 2 or 3 clips that you might be able to show somebody on YouTube, but there's very little, because he played in the 3rd division and because it was the 70s. So what was his style of play?
His style of play was, I mean, Eamon Dunphy called him a warrior, and I think that's what he was. So he was a centre forward who would get back and fight for the ball. The Reading FC historian David Downs said that it was almost a case of Robin, particularly when he was at Reading, of him standing there and saying, "Here, give me the ball and I'll do something with it," and he'd disappear out onto the wing. I think in terms of whatever instructions were given to him by Charlie Hurley or Jimmy Andrews at Cardiff City, they went out the window. He did what he wanted to do. And obviously football now is very different to how it was back then in the 60s and 70s, but obviously particularly the 70s. And centre halves would come into you, smash into you. Robin stood his ground, but also, you know, let's not shy away from it. He gave it out. There's one particular story that I have in the book. It's in the second half, and what he'd done in a game against Sheffield United, he suffered from asthma, and he put his inhaler. He had it in a wooden box, and he popped it into his wrist, and every time a ball came over, he'd jump up, and there was a pop, and the players would go, "What's that?" And it was and he was hitting them with this box. And so every time they went up, there was this wallop and this popping sound, to which the Sheffield United captain was like, "What's going on here? Tell him to calm down. What's going on?" And you know, so he did have that side to him as well. But as a player, his ability, you know, they talk about this goal that he scored against Tranmere, the one that, you know, 3 million people have seen, but there was only 10,900 in the crowd. And they said, you know, on a training pitch, he could do that. the likes of the people that I've spoken to, David Joss, John Buchanan, would just say he was, and they all say to a T, he was a bit like George Best in that he could just do what he wanted to do with this ball. But what they said, David Giles said, you know, to look at him, you'd look at him with these, he was pigeon-toed, really bowed legs. He didn't look like a footballer, and the way he moved, but somehow he just had this way of moving, and the ball would almost like would stick to him. He could just, if the ball's up there 7 feet in the air, he can get up to it and he can bring it down, or it's, you know, it's skied up into the air. He can, you know, control it on a 2-pence piece. It's the way, you know, playing the ball off the outside of his foot. Apparently, that because they say the way that he was pigeon-toed, the way that he struck the ball gave it that extra spin, which would often sort of confuse the goalies and would give him these sort of magnificent goals. But he enjoyed scoring as much as he enjoyed setting it up for, you know, for teammates. He'd go in there and take the flak. I think if you've got a guy that, I think he was 5'10", and he'd get in there very early on in a game, make himself known. And once you've done that, people quite often wouldn't want to go near him again, whether it was a kiss or a pinch or, you know, what have you. So, yeah, you know, technically his ability was up there. His pace wasn't the best in the world. And that was simply to do with his physical attributes, should we say, with his legs and things. But in terms of putting the ball about and passes and his vision, it was his vision. People would say that he was 3 or 4 steps ahead of everybody else. And he was quite well known for having a go at the other players, saying, you know, why are you doing that? Why aren't we doing this? So, you know, he was a very intelligent footballer. One thing that sometimes said, his positional play wasn't the best, because it was a case of the manager would say, I want you there. When we're doing this at a free kick, go and do this. But he wouldn't do that. He had his own way of doing that. So.
Yeah, he was a big man as well, so he could throw himself about if he wanted to. One thing that interests me there is that often when you're talking about the best players like George Best, Johan Cruyff, these players, people always think it's their talent with the ball and what they can make the ball do. But often it is that they can make decisions a lot quicker in their head and see things a lot faster than other players. And that's something that's always said about Lionel Messi, that he is about 10 seconds ahead of everyone else. And in terms of his ceiling and where he could have gone, this is, for context, this is 1970s. So the third division isn't actually that outreachable to the first division. The likes of Leeds went from the second division up and won the league the following year. So in terms of his raw natural ability, apart from the off-field stuff that's going on, do you get the feeling that he was good enough to play probably first division football?
I do. I really do. But if I can put that into context as well, things would have to have changed in order for that to happen. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I just read a quote of Robins, and this is him sort of setting, this was taken from February 1974, and in an interview, and he says, I reckon I've got 12 years in football from now. After that, I can't think that far ahead. I suppose, like everybody else, my ambition must be to play for a first division club. If you don't think like that, there wouldn't be any point in being in the game. And if I can, you know, that's what he wanted. But also, if I can qualify that, Jimmy Andrews, you know, knew a lot about football, and he said that Robin Friday was a player that was quite often in the international class. Now, there were Welsh internationals at Cardiff at the time, and if I can steal another quote from a player, Jack Witham, who played for Liverpool, played for Cardiff City, and played with Robin at Reading. And Jimmy Andrews phoned him prior to signing Robbie for Cardiff City, and he said, "What about this player? What about Robin Friday?" And he said, on ability alone, Liverpool Football Club should sign should sign Robin Friday. But with everything else, if Cardiff City signed him, they'd regret it within a year. And sadly, that was the case. Jimmy said, and quite a few of the other lads said, if somebody would have got hold of Robin at 15 or 16 and taken him under their wing and looked after him and kept him away from certain influences on his life, then that would have changed it. He could have been a first division footballer. They talk about, I mean, people say he could have been an England international. Well, there was a lot going on with the England team at the time, and taking into account Robin's pace, you've got to think about that. But ability, if it's about ability, he had it all. Could they have found a role for him perhaps? But yeah, he could have played first division football, no doubt, ability wise, and that's coming from a lot of different people who played at the top as well. But
yeah, so
it's that discipline. He didn't have the discipline.
Yeah, so that's Liverpool European Cup winners multiple times in the 70s as well. So you're talking top of the top. Let's talk about the sidetracks then, and what was distracting him from football and why he didn't make it to the higher level. What is going on with him during his career at Reading and even in Cardiff as well? The Cardiff move seemed to be a disaster for everybody.
Yeah, it did. I mean, things was started. I mean, going right back, he got into a certain way of living, and that was going out and essentially, living like a 1970s rock star who was earning 50 quid a week when he was at Reading. So you've got that going on. You've got things happening to his brother legally with the police and stuff off the pitch. You've got Robin getting into trouble off the pitch as well, nights out in Reading and things. The drugs obviously play a part to mask it, if you like, and then the girlfriends and what was going on there. I think he tried to do too much too soon. With the drugs, that's a driver really. In terms of physically, he was a very, very strong character. You've got to think he was asthmatic as well, and then he's doing all this stuff on the side, which, as I said before, it's fun to start with, and then once you go in that, you're going into dark places, and if you haven't been in those places, it's very difficult to I think to understand it. And he definitely went there. There was all sorts going on. He had his first daughter, his second daughter. The move to Cardiff was, like you say, it went wrong. It went wrong for everybody. Cardiff was and is a very proud football club, and they had certain expectations. Obviously, Robin turned up on his first day to sign there and got nicked by the British Transport Police, and it kind of went downhill from there. I think he just spread himself too thinly. I think you can do it for a certain while, and he did, which is why his career, but kind of, it was like a meteor really. And which is why he went that way. He did. I mean, he walked out on Cardiff on the 20th of December 77, but actually, and I talk about it in the book, he actually went back to speak to Jimmy Andrews to try and get back in, because he changed his mind, which again goes against that. Or the guy didn't care. Now, obviously, there were times he didn't care. But he definitely did, and I think I talk about that in the book. I mean, I definitely do, in that you don't do the things that he did to himself if you didn't care. Obviously, he didn't at times, but he definitely did.
It's quite a sensitive issue, but do you get the feeling that there was mental issues there for him? At any stage?
I think without a shadow of doubt. I mean, we're far more open about it these days, and we'll talk about it, and it's great that footballers now will come out and talk about it and share their issues, and there's some great advocates for that now in the game. back then, you're talking, obviously, like we were saying earlier, this is a lad that was born in 1952. He's grown up then. You've got obviously what went on during the war. There's this kind of height. It's like, you've got to be tough, and you know, you get on and you get up, and which is why I had to grow up so quickly. It was, yeah, you forget about this. Go, you've got a problem, go down the pub, get out of your mind. He obviously did other things as well. There definitely were. I mean, the players at Cardiff talk about that and talk about that openly. Phil Dwyer said in his autobiography that he think, looking back on it now, he thinks that Robin had that. There was an interview that I think it was Owen from the 42 did with Bill Irwin, the keeper, and he said that there was definitely something going on there, without a shadow of a doubt, you know.
Yeah, it's sort of like George Best when you look at his career. In many ways, you look at the times that he had, and he was enjoying himself, and he made people laugh, but often behind the scenes, it's a tragedy as opposed to a comedy, and that's sort of the feeling I get with Robin Friday as well. After he retires, what is his fate after that? Because I want to continue the George Best comparison, just because it is very similar.
It is.
Does he fall out of love completely with football? Does he go off the rails in terms of his personal life, or how does he react to his career coming to an end?
Without giving too much away in my second book, because there are things in there that I found out that just aren't known about, because obviously, going back to the book that was done in 97, that was 20 years afterwards. Everyone's cool about what happened, but there were some very angry people at the time, back in 77. I think, looking back on his life, it would have been one of his great regrets up there, you know, because he could have done it. He could have achieved what he really set out to achieve. He did turn his back on football. He tried to get back into it, but because of what he'd done to himself, you know, physically, I mean, because of the way, not just with what he'd done to himself with the drugs, but also what he'd put himself through sort of physically, what those drugs do to you physically, but also in those games, you know, where people are kicking, they'd kick him, he'd kick back, and he kind of, I think it was his left knee, he definitely had sort of injuries that will have affected him as well. But he fell kind of out of love with the game, and it's very sad. I mean, I won't spoil it for anyone, but what happened in 77 at Cardiff was kind of that, as the old saying goes, it put the tin hat on it. It really did. There were legal things that were going off the pitch, and that had a big impact. Some of those I've put in the book, some I haven't. I've kind of held them back. But yeah, there's what's known about him currently. It's different. It's different, and I think what I've tried to do, Enda, is try to be honest about it all, about his footballing ability, but also about what was going on, because I think that's important. I've tried to search for some sort of truth, you know.
Yeah, and that's always one of the more difficult ones, is that people see the story of these superstars and these tragic figures, and they just look at the facts and say, oh, he's an alcoholic or he did drugs, but rarely people look at why they did these things and what caused that and what the context is to that. And there's context to everything, and I suppose you look more deeply into that in your book. In terms of the books, where can people find them if they want to get them or read them?
They can go to Amazon, and they're on there if they search Stuart Kane, or if they just type in Man Friday the first half or Man Friday the second half, and they'll find them. I mean, it's really taken me on a journey, and I've had some. I think when you look at somebody's life so deeply, and I really have, I've studied it for 5 years. I've given this everything, and I've got the guys that played with him, or people that watched him, or knew him, say to me, you know, this is the real deal. This is authentic. And when you have that from people, I wasn't there, and I'm not a time traveler, but I've really, you know, kind of gone into this, and I've had some very strange things that have happened along the way as well. I about 2.5 years in, I nearly gave up writing the book, and I just one day I decided that this was too much hard work. And I work as a teacher as well, and I thought, you know, I'm going to give this up on a Friday night. Felt very relieved. It was like a weight had been lifted. I was like, this is fantastic. And I phoned a friend of mine. I said, "Do you fancy a game of tennis tomorrow? We'll go and have a knock around." And so we went and played tennis. I don't play very well. Came back, I'm on my bike, and feeling very relieved. I'm going to watch Football Focus at 12 o'clock. Going along, and down the road, I live in Birmingham, and down the road, there's a lad walking. And this is true, with over his shoulder, he's got a tennis racket. And he's wearing a Reading football shirt, listening to music, slightly long hair. It wasn't obviously Robin Friday, but I was like, that's ridiculous. And I just said, "Hey, Robin Friday." And he goes, "Yeah, Robin Friday." And I got back, and I thought that I took that as a message not to give up. And it, you know, it's been a journey. It's been great. You know, I found out some things since I've written it, but it all lines up with what I've written. So, you know, it's been a search for the truth, and a different way of I think looking at the story. There's a lot of humor in there, so it's not just the darkness. It's about his humor. It's about his brilliant football ability. It's about people like Eamon Dunphy and Charlie Hurley. So you know, if people enjoyed The Damned United, I think they'd very much enjoy this book.
Well, Stuart Kane, author of Man Friday, thanks for joining me today. Best luck with the book.
Thank you very much, Enda.